Hi and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our next session in our Politics with Paul series on the U.S. Civics course, which is covering the first section of the U.S. Constitution lesson, which is the after Revolution assignment. My name is Paul. I am the social studies instructor here at Penn Foster High School. Some of the best ways to be able to reach out, ask any questions. Of course, this webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to get this recording tomorrow afternoon and be able to view it anytime you want. But if you do have follow-up questions, you can certainly use our phone number, our 1-888-427-1000. There is the academic help or instructor line, and that'll get you right into the high school department. You can also use your help and support page to be able to send in an email, as well as both live help session and additional webinars are also available for not only civics, but also other courses as well. So please make sure that you're kind of keeping an eye on that schedule. Myself and the other instructors do tend to send out message center alerts letting you know when other webinars are coming available. So keep an eye on that in the future. We also have this texting service. If you text 39033, you text the word learn, you'll come in direct contact with a member of the educational staff, and that again is a great way to be able to get in contact with us, be able to ask any questions you have. Within the webinar recording, you'll also get a link to our appointment scheduler, where you'd be able to set up an appointment with myself or one of my teaching assistants in social studies that we can certainly go over any material, any questions you have about the course, either U.S. Civics or any of the other social studies courses that you have. So please be aware that that is available and is certainly open to you. In terms of just kind of general support that I often give students when students are struggling, when they have questions, is really paying attention to the reading assignments within your lessons. You have objectives that really are meant to help you, guide you in terms of what are the most important parts of the course, most important part of the lesson, to make sure that you are focusing on those. And even taking notes and doing the practice exercises, again, based on those objectives, are a great way to make sure that you are understanding the material. So the better you understand the material, the better you're going to do on your exam, which is multiple choice. They are open book, so being able to go back over your reading assignments as you're preparing for your exam or taking the exam is certainly available. So please be aware of all that material and certainly aware of all the support that we do offer. And if you ever want to reach out and ask for additional forms of support or just checking on the support that's available for a course, the phone call, the email is certainly are certainly the best ways to be able to just reach out. The texting service is also available for any of our courses. In terms of our webinar today, we're going to be looking at the problems that arise with our first Constitution, which was called the Articles of Confederation. We'll also look at the decisions and the compromises within the Constitutional Convention that came about to create a new Constitution. And then also the process and the events within the ratification of the Constitution. And by all means, if you do have questions, you can certainly type them in into the chat feature or the questions, and I'll do my best to answer those. Otherwise, you can certainly ask them towards the end. I'll keep the line open for a few minutes after the webinar is complete to be able to ask any of your additional questions. So towards the very end of our American Revolution, our founders, our political idea makers, were decide to create a constitution that written down laws and written down format of our new government was essential to make sure that the government worked. And they created this government in part as a reaction to the British government and the British Empire. And in doing so, they really created some very large weaknesses that became very apparent as the Articles of Confederation were being used or being done. The first big one was the fact that the federal government could not tax. They could not tax directly the citizens directly, and the states that did collect taxes from the citizens were not required to give the federal government were not required to give Congress any amount of money, any set amount of money. So they ended up, it was really just a voluntary action. If the states wanted to give money, had money to give to the federal government, it was very little money that the states actually were willing to give the federal government. And in response to this, our federal employees and more importantly our soldiers, especially those who had fought in the Revolutionary War, were not getting paid. And again, this is a direct reflection of how our founders really were concerned with the British Empire and their form of government, that they saw that the Parliament could just tax everyone within the empire, even though folks in the American colonies in Asia, in Africa, in other parts of Europe, in the rest of the Americas, they had no say in the Parliament. So the Articles of Confederation and the framers really thought that they wanted to just allow the closest form of government, the state government, the local government, to tax. This was a fine ideal, a fine concept, but in practice, when the Articles of Confederation were actually being used, this was just a huge failure, a huge problem that the Articles provided. They also had no court or executive federal branches. So the presidency, the courts that we know today did not exist. The Congress itself was very dysfunctional. It could not pass laws because it required a majority of all of the 13 states to ratify any law, and that was very difficult. That both the Southern, the Western, the Northern, all these states, all these groups of states had different ideas. And so the government itself just could not function as just a Congress, as just a body that could not come to a consensus. The federal government also could not regulate commerce and interstate trade, meaning that the state of New York, for instance, could set up its own trade policy with with a state like Pennsylvania or New Jersey, and they could be completely different trade policies. And so if New Jersey was getting a better deal than Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania would be resentful towards both governments, both New York and New Jersey, and cause trade wars, could cause conflict just within the states of the U.S. Each state could also set up their own trade policies with other countries. So Great Britain could have a very favorable policy with New York or with Massachusetts, and have a very bad policy with North Carolina or Georgia. And again, this caused conflict, this caused problems between states. And again, the federal government had no power and had no authority to be able to control the trade, the commerce between the states and between the United States and other countries. And finally, the federal government had no standing army. It could not enforce law and order. It could also have no way of checking or monitoring the policies and the laws at the state or local level. So if there was an unfair law that was against the Articles of Confederation, they could not enforce the Articles. Without the courts, without a standing army, without a police force at the federal level, there was no way that our government could enforce the laws that it had created. Many of these issues really came to a head with what's called Shays Rebellion. And in sort of the setting up of this process, the state of Massachusetts had a very tough tax policy. And in particular, looking at its debt policy towards the farming community of the state. That because farmers had some of this unfair treatment in commerce, in the fact that they could not bring any arguments to a federal court saying that the debt and the taxes that were being put on them by the state of Massachusetts was unfair, there was no resolution. And Massachusetts was actually raising its taxes consistently because they were in debt from the American Revolution. If you recall, Massachusetts and particularly Boston had a lot of the blame, had a lot of the conflict with the British, especially early on. And so the state itself was in a rebuilding process after the American Revolution, and that cost money. And without federal dollars, without federal money from other states, Massachusetts was really on its own. So its government had to raise money in order to pay off its debt to be able to rebuild. And it laid its debt really on the farmers, on businesses to be able to raise enough money to do so. But as farmers, particularly farmers, were in debt and were not able to pay their taxes, the state ended up sending them to prison, what's called debtor's prison. And so forcing them to be in prison to work just to pay off their debts, not necessarily be able to work to live, but to pay off the state. And even though the federal government disagreed with this law, they saw this as a problem that the state was sending so many people to prison, so many people, a generally unfair tax policy. The federal government was not able to stop it. In comes Daniel Shay, who was a farmer himself in Massachusetts. He fought in the Revolution, and he was among the soldiers who was not paid. That the federal government did not have enough money to pay Shay and any of his anyone else in the military. So he returned to farming in Massachusetts. He ends up becoming in danger of going to debt and going to debt prison. So he leads an uprising of farmers, nothing like a full-fledged rebellion that we would think of as the American Revolution, but he wanted the state to stay away from the farmers, stay away from those who had fallen into debt. So he led a group of farmers to the state armory, be able to collect weapons. And the federal government could not have or did not have an army to be able to send to enforce law and order. It ended up being the state militia, but even the state militia took time to enforce law because many of those in the militia were former farmers or were farmers themselves. And they actually sided with Shay and his rebellion and his uprising instead of the state. So it took a long time simply because so many people sided with Shay, left the militia, joined his rebellion, his revolt, I should say, and the federal government had no way of dealing with this. So this really caused a lot of fear, caused a lot of anxiety within this new government, within this new country, because for many of the people, many of the new American citizens, they had no idea if this government was going to work. This was a brand new form of government, a brand new principle of self-rule, the principle of representative democracy. No one knew that if this was going to work. And this Shays Rebellion and the failures of the Articles of Confederation really put a lot of doubt in the minds of the citizens of the United States. And this leads us to our first poll question. How did Shays Rebellion show flaws in the Articles of Confederation? That the federal law was not followed, that federal government could not stop the rebellion, or Shays' business could not sell outside Massachusetts. How did Shays' Rebellion show the flaws within the government or within the Articles of Confederation? Give you guys a little while, 30 seconds to answer. Okay, give you guys about 5 seconds. Okay, thank you. So the answer being that it showed the federal government could not stop the rebellion. It generally showed the weakness within the government. and within this new Constitution. Okay. Were there any questions about this section before we move on? Okay, no questions so far. So this eventually causes, like I said, a lot of anxiety. And in particular, the state of Virginia was among the first to call for a revision of the Articles of Confederation. They saw this problem. They saw that this could just cause chaos within this new government and within this new country. And more importantly, many of the leaders knew or believed that if there was chaos within the new government, within the new country, Britain or any other of the more powerful countries in Europe could very easily come back and take over the country, take over this new country of ours. So once the delegates arrive in Philadelphia, they start talking about how to revise the Articles, and they soon realized that the Articles of Confederation were just too bad to revise, that a new constitution was required in order to fix the problems that need to be fixed. And in short order, some basic decisions were made. Now, we generally know these decisions and know the process because several of the framers, several of the writers of the Constitution were writing letters or writing diary entries about this process. Most of this was very secretive. And the reason they wanted to make this a secret process was that they knew if people knew the process that the founders were going through, that the writers of the Constitution were going through, that the population would be very upset, that they would see a revision of the Constitution as an attack on Americans' freedoms. That would be an attack on that the rebellion was going to be for nothing because this new Constitution could be written. So in general, we find out a lot from John Adams, from James Madison, among several others, about the processes that were being made. So right off the bat, the convention agrees that there needed to be a stronger role for the federal government, that this weak Articles of Confederation was not going to work, that it needed to be a stronger government that had authority within the whole country. They also decided that we were going to have a 3 branches of government, including an independent judiciary, as well as the legislative branch with Congress and the presidency as the executive branch. We'll talk a little bit more about the presidency itself and Congress. There was some disagreement about those 2 branches. They also agreed that slavery itself was not going to be addressed. There were some in the North who wanted to abolish slavery within this constitutional convention, to make it part of the Constitution itself, that slavery would not be allowed. There was enough support within the South and in parts of the North as well to make this a non-issue, that many of the Constitutional Convention members did believe that slavery should eventually be abolished, that it should eventually be removed from society, but they wanted it done by Congress. That once they create a Congress, once they create a federal government, that would be up to the Congress to decide when slavery would be abolished. We unfortunately know in history that Congress just couldn't do it, and that would eventually come to the Civil War in the 1860s to finally abolish slavery. But at the time, our founders believed that they could not make that decision, which ended up unfortunately becoming part of the American narrative for the first 100 years of pushing this problem of slavery down the road. That the next group of politicians will be the ones who fix it, not our current one. So as I mentioned, so these were the sort of the semi-easy decisions, and the first real argument that came up was how the Congress would be represented and what it would look like. And the first plan that was created was set up by James Madison, was announced by James Madison, and it was called the Virginia Plan, or became known as the Larger State Plan. And James Madison called for a bicameral legislature, meaning two houses, and that the lower house would be based on state population, and that the upper house, so the lower house becomes our House of Representatives, our upper house, which would now be considered the U.S. Senate, would be members that are picked by the lower house. That's still based on state population, but instead of being directly elected like in the lower house, the upper house members would be selected by the lower house. This plan clearly helps the larger states, that the larger the population, the more representatives you have in the Congress. So Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, North Carolina, South Carolina, they all supported this plan. The Virginia plan also called for one chief executive as president of the United States. The other plan that was established, or that was called for, was the New Jersey plan, which was written by William Paterson of New Jersey. The Jersey plan called for one House legislature, and that it would be equal representatives. So if New Jersey had 2 representatives, New York would have 2 representatives, Virginia would have 2 representatives, Maryland would have 2 representatives. So making a much more equal amount of representatives, not based on population. This, again, certainly favors the smaller states, so they have the same political power as a larger state. The New Jersey plan also called for multiple executives. The idea being that because the country was large, because there were many responsibilities that the executive branch would hold, Patterson believed that multiple people could hold the office of president and be in charge of different responsibilities. And that leads us to our next poll question. How would states vote in Congress under the New Jersey plan? That representatives are based on population, that each state would have 1 vote, or that one house has equal representation, the other has representative by population. Give you guys another 10 seconds to mark down your answer. All right, finishing up in 3, 2, 1. Thank you. So it was that each state would have the same vote. So each state would have 1 vote within the 1 House Congress. So the compromise between these 2 legislative branches comes from the state of Connecticut, and particularly its delegate was Roger Sherman. And his compromise was that we would create a bicameral legislature, so 2 houses. The first house, which is now considered the House of Representatives, is based on the population of each state. So the more people you have in the state, the more representatives you have in the House of Representatives. And the population is based on the census, which does calculate or does count the number of people in the nation every 10 years. So in 2010, we had a census, and before the next election in 2012, there was this change of the number of representatives from each state, and each state had to change their representative map based on the number of representatives that they had. Some states lost seats in Congress, in the House of Representatives. Some states gained seats in the House of Representatives. Some remained the same depending on their population. The process of that will be covered more in future parts of this lesson. The upper house, called the Senate, is equal representation. So every state has 2 members of the Senate. Originally, when the Constitution was written, the members of the Senate would be originally voted on by the state legislature. Since 1917, the Senate, the senators are now voted, or since 1917, senators have now been popularly voted. So in last year's election, in next year's election, we'll have all the members of the House of Representatives up for re-election, and we'll have a set of senators. About a third of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. So we'll see that those direct votes for both the House and the Senate next year, just as we did last fall and last November. As another part of the compromise, as I mentioned before, slavery, whether or not slavery was legal or not was sort of left as a future question. What was part of the discussion was how slaves would be counted, as in part of the census. And in the South, they actually wanted slaves counted as people, and the North opposed it. They didn't want slaves to be counted as people. Now this is sort of an interesting part of the argument, because for many in the South, their argument for slavery was the fact that their slaves were not really people. They were farm hands. They were essentially added. They almost treated them like animals within the farm, on the plantation. And many in the North opposed slavery, saying, "Well, wait a minute. These are people. These slaves should be treated as people." But now the argument is reversed out of politics. The South wanted as many representatives in Congress, in the House of Representatives, as they could. So they wanted the slaves counted as part of their population. The North, knowing that they would have more representatives in Congress if slaves weren't counted, opposed the idea of slaves being counted as people. So we sort of see both sides sort of flipping opinions in this argument. The compromise becomes known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. The slave would be counted as a person, but counted as 3/5 of a person. So not quite a whole person. Essentially, 5 slaves in the census would be counted as 3 free people. The Connecticut Compromise also called for just one president as the head of the executive branch, but then they would have cabinet members to administer, to organize parts of the government. So just like President Trump has his cabinet, he has a secretary, a cabinet official in charge of the State Department to handle foreign affairs, a Defense Department to handle the military, the Treasury Department to handle currency issues. So all the issues that come under the power of the executive branch, the president oversees them, but he has specific cabinet officials that are in charge of that. The other part of the compromise was how the president would be selected. Some members of the Constitutional Convention wanted the president to be elected as in a direct vote. So whoever got the popular vote per se in an election would be elected president. The majority decided on what's called the Electoral College. That the number of electors within the college were the same as the members of Congress. And so the more populated states have more electoral votes and have a greater ability to elect the president of the United States. The electors would, in the future, so thinking about today, many of the electors that go to elect the president typically will vote the same as the population within the state. So, for instance, the state of Pennsylvania, the majority voted for President Trump. So the electors, those who went to the Electoral College, also voted for President Trump to go with the popular vote within each state. Most states, as I said, are now set up in a way that the electors have to follow the popular vote. So even if they personally disagree with the vote of the majority of the citizens in the state, they are required to follow the representatives. I thought I saw a hand up, but if you do have questions, feel free to type in. This is these are a couple of very complicated issues. If you do have questions, please feel free to type them in. Okay, no questions right now. Actually, this brings us to our another poll question. Which of the following was not a slavery issue by the Constitutional Congress? How they are counted, that slavery remains legal in the U.S., or that slaves should be sold as families, which was not an issue that was brought up and decided upon in the Constitutional Convention. Okay, finishing up in 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you. So it was the fact that should slaves be sold as families? That was not an issue. The fact that slavery remains legal in the U.S. was part of the constitutional decision, or the convention's decision, and that they were hoping that the Congress eventually would decide that slavery should be legal. But the Constitutional Convention also decided how slaves should be counted as representatives. So now that the Constitution has been written, has been agreed upon by the Constitutional Convention, it then goes to the ratification process. And the Constitution actually describes how it should be ratified. And within the Constitution, it states that it must be ratified by all, that there should be votes by all 13 states, and that 9 of them were required to actually approve the Constitution. This entire process took about 3 years, and it began sort of the process of political parties in our government, or in our country. The Federalists were those who supported the Constitution, and Anti-Federalists were those who were against, particularly a stronger federal government. That the Anti-Federalists were against the Constitution, believing that the federal government was too strong. And part of the process of the ratification process was that the Federalists created what's called these Federalist Papers. And they were written as a way of persuading New York to ratify the Constitution. New York was actually one of the last states to ratify. And all of the authors only went by the same name, Publius, which means the public, the people. It was the Federalist Papers were primarily written by three individuals, three very famous individuals in terms of American politics. Alexander Hamilton, who was a delegate from New York to the Constitutional Convention. He was a very strong supporter of the Constitution, believing that a stronger government would be more beneficial for society. He also would eventually become the first Treasury Secretary of the United States under George Washington. He really establishes the model of the American economy during his tenure, during his time as Secretary of the Treasury. That is why he is even still now on the $10 bill, because of how much he influenced the form of the economy of the United States. James Madison also wrote the Federalist Papers. He is known as the father of the Constitution, in part because of how he dealt with the other members of the convention, how he was able to make deals as well. He was first in Congress. He actually becomes the Speaker of the House in the first Congress. And he is the fourth President of the United States. The last writer was John Jay, who would become the first Supreme Court Chief Justice under George Washington. And that leads us to our final poll question. Which of the Federalist Papers became President of the United States? Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, or John Jay? Who becomes president? There's only one who becomes president. Finishing up in about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, it was James Madison. So our fourth president. Hamilton is the Treasury Secretary, and then dies in a duel with the Vice President of Thomas Jefferson. And John Jay, he becomes the Chief Justice. He is Chief Justice for about during Washington's time as president, and John Adams' time as president. But then he retires in 1800. And he doesn't serve as president. So that is the end of my presentation. Are there any questions on the United States Constitution lesson, or specifically about this part of the lesson? I will stay on. Looks like there aren't any currently, but I will stay on for another 5 minutes or so. Thank you so much for your attendance and your participation in the poll questions. Like I said, if you do have questions, feel free to type them in. Otherwise, the recording you'll receive tomorrow in an email, just like the registration email. And you'll also receive the link to our to the social studies scheduling appointment page. So you'll be able to set up any type of an appointment that you would like to be able to speak with me or one of the teaching assistants for the social studies courses. But thank you again so much for attending. Have a good day and good luck with your program.